One of the things that I've seen requested the most by a lot of you is to make a dedicated video on the item shop. And well, this is that video. To set some expectations though, if you're already pretty good at the game and already have hundreds of hours locked into Deadlock, then this all may just not be that useful to you. I will definitely do more than just go over the basic description of items, like I'll explain when items are good purchases or bad purchases, or when better players typically pick certain items and how they're used. But that is also where it ends. Even though this video is pretty long and is not going to include every edge case scenario out there for every single hero and every single matchup, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I'm pretty sure I don't even know about yet, and this being a closed alpha, stuff is still subject to change. I mean, they just updated almost half of the items in the shop. So for those looking for some more advanced guides maybe, some higher level guides with some real gameplay, how to win those games, I see you, I hear you. Maybe you don't want to see me stuck in the shooting range for over half an hour plus. I get you. And I will say that that stuff is coming very soon. I just wanted to make sure to have covered all the basics on the channel first. And this is the last video on that list. So yeah, with that out of the way, let's get to the item shop and start looking at how to think about items in Deadlock. To recap the basics of the store really fast, there are 3 item categories. There's weapon, vitality, and spirit, which generally boosts your weapon damage, your survivability, and your abilities respectively. Now within those 3 item categories, there are also 4 subcategories that divide all of those items by their price range. This is what we usually refer to as tiers. A tier 1 item costs 500 souls, a tier 2 item costs 1250, a tier 3 item costs 3000, and a tier 4 item costs 6300 or more. Do note though that the items in the weapon category also buff your melee damage, because weapon damage as a stat also applies for 50% to melee damage. So if you have 10% weapon damage, that equals to 5% melee damage. And then when it comes to spirit items, well, you'd need to look at the specific spirit power multiplier for each individual ability to see how effective it is to stack spirit power for your hero. I've made a video on that as well, but the short story is that the higher the multiplier is, which you can see by hovering over your abilities with the Alt button pressed, the better they scale per point of spirit power. Also, some of the items in the store are a bit more expensive than their tier would let on, but that is always because they include other cheaper items to make them. A good example would be to look at Silencer, a tier 4 weapon item that costs not 6300 souls, but 7550. That is because it has slowing bullets as a component. That is a tier 2 weapon item. The 7550 is the 1250 price from the slowing bullets plus the 6300 that the silencer would have cost without it. Do note that if you upgrade an item, the stats on it replace whatever the stats the component had. It does not just add them together. Debuff Reducer, for example, has a 30% debuff resistance on it, and it can be upgraded to Debuff Remover, which has a 35% debuff resistance. This means that the total you would have after getting Debuff Remover would just be 35% and not 65%. And that goes for every other item in the store that has components. You can always just see the total value that you're getting by looking at the last item on the item chain. There is a distinction to be made between active and passive items too. Passive items sort of just boost the stats of your characters in different ways without you having to do too much. And active items go into one of your 4 active item slots, which will require you to press the item hotkey to use them, much like a basic ability. The active items in the shop are colored slightly more bright than the passive ones, and if you want to ever put an active item in a different hotkey slot, you can hold down Alt and drag the item to move them over. Every item that you buy also goes into one of your 12 item slots. You can have a total of 4 weapon items, 4 vitality items, and 4 spirit items, but during a game you can also unlock 4 flex slots that you can use to just put any type of item into. As of the latest patch, these flex slots are unlocked by killing all of the opponent's guardians, by killing the first walker, by killing all of the opponent's walkers, and then killing the first base shrine. All of these are buildings located on the map. So yeah, it's just milestones pretty much. And then very last up for the basics, you can also make a build yourself so that you don't have to memorize what items to pick each and every game. But of course, to make a build, you first have to understand what items might be good on certain characters. So we'll look at builds really quick at the end of this video, because I believe that after this video, you'll have a good enough understanding of the shop that you can actually make your own build and have it be pretty good. Now that was a whole wash list of information that you probably already knew, which means that we're now going to move on to looking at the individual items and seeing when you might take them. And we're going to do this for only the tier 1 and the tier 2 items, because I am confident that after looking at just those, you'll be able to use the information in this video and just extrapolate it to whatever else is in the shop. I mean, that is ultimately what this video is about, right? Teaching you how to think about items, not necessarily what every item specifically does. So yeah, starting with the tier 1 items, let's have a good look at these. Oftentimes they don't receive a lot of attention from the newer players because saving up for the more expensive items must surely be worth it in the long run, right? But that is actually not the case, and you'd be surprised to learn that pound for pound or soul for soul, the cheap tier 1 items are actually the most powerful items in the game. And one of the first things that I always tell people when they ask me what to buy or whether to save or spend their souls is to not be too shy with the tier 1 items, and yes, it is generally better to buy one too many than to skip out on a few, saving for a bigger item. Look at Extra Spirit and Boundless Spirit, for example. Two items that both give the player a bunch of spirit power. The Extra Spirit item is a tier 1 item and the Boundless Spirit item is a tier 4 item. Now obviously Boundless Spirit gives you more spirit in total, far more spirit actually, but if we do the math per soul that you're spending at the shop, it's actually the tier 1 item that is giving you a lot more bang for your buck. You're spending about 42 souls for 1 point of spirit power with the tier 1 item, but with the tier 4 item, that number has gone up to 122, which makes Extra Spirit almost 3 times as cost efficient. We won't go too much into the math here, but all you have to know is that there is a reason as to why the game is designed like this. For one is that as the game goes on, as you get into the late game, you will naturally start earning more souls per minute for whatever you do. That could be killing the creeps, killing the minions, it could be taking the neutral camps, the jungle, in between the lanes, and even for killing players you'll end up getting more souls. But then also the big reason as to why these early items are so much more powerful relatively to how much they cost is because, well, you only have 12 slots for items, 4 of each type. And at some point in every game, you'll have so many souls that you can easily swap out one of your tier 1 items for something stronger, even if it isn't the most cost efficient thing to do on paper. If we would have unlimited inventory slots, then all we would buy would just be an unlimited amount of tier 1 items. All of this is especially true because when you sell your items, you always get half of the souls back. So even if you buy a bunch of tier 1 items early on that you might not need later into the game, you would only lose out on 250 souls per item in the absolute worst case scenario. In the best case scenario, you can just upgrade that item into something else. This of course is not to say that you should go ahead and stack 12 tier 1 items at the start of every game, because at some point you'll be strong enough to do pretty much whatever you want to do in the lane, and if you're still not winning, well, then you're just having a bad matchup or a really bad day. Stacking more tier 1 items is not going to make that difference. But the one thing that you definitely shouldn't do is start saving up for big items right from the get-go. One way that I always look at it, especially early on in the laning phase when things could still go either way or the other, is ask myself if the item that I'm buying is possibly going to get me 250 extra souls this game. And if the answer is yes, because I'm low, and if I buy this healing Rite, I will not have to back the base and miss a whole wave of minions, then getting said item should almost be a no-brainer. Because just killing 3 extra minions will allow me to buy this item and then sell it later at no souls lost. Now admittedly, the answer isn't always so easy, which is why these games can take a long time to master and why even this video cannot tell you exactly what to buy each game. But my point is that you shouldn't overlook the tier 1 items. They are far stronger than you might think, and they can often set you up for success until deep into the mid game, even if you eventually have to get rid of them. Okay, so with the purpose of these tier 1 items out of the way, let's now go down the list of all of these tier 1 items and look at what you might want to generally take in which situations. There's a lot of information here that will also apply to the tier 2 items, to the tier 3 items, and even to the tier 4 items. It's just that with the tier 1 items, we're going to look at it specifically from a laning perspective, because that is when you'll be buying these items. You're buying them to lane, to win your lane, to potentially go and help your teammates on their lane. And so we only have to look at these items from that perspective without thinking about the bigger picture. And again, in a future patch, some of these values might be different, The point is that you get a better understanding of why items are strong and how to use them, rather than just knowing that rapid rounds gives you an X amount of rate of fire, right? So starting off with the weapon category, the single most straightforward item to look at is Basic Mag, which grants you 24% ammo and 21% weapon damage, because it says 15 here, but you also get the +6 from it just being a tier 1 item. And if you now start thinking about when you might want to pick this up, well, it is typically good on heroes that have a high rate of fire on their weapons with smaller magazines. A perfect example would be Ivy. If you're trying to shove the lane with Ivy, you'll often find that you can empty an entire magazine on one of the minions, while just not having enough ammo for that one bullet to also hit the orb with. And although that is also partly a gameplay problem, where you could have waited with hitting the troopers a little bit, an item that can aid with this is the Basic Mag. We'll talk about Headshot Booster too, but first up I want to skip over to High Velocity Mag, because it's very comparable to Basic Mag in the sense that it aims to combat some of the weaknesses specific to a hero's gun. We talked about Basic Mag in the sense that it is useful when your character has a very high RPM and thus burns through ammo and thus has to reload a lot. But High Velocity Mag kind of helps out with a different issue, which is a low bullet velocity. Examples of characters with guns that have a low bullet velocity are Kelvin, Viscous, Dynamo, and because of the low velocity, these heroes can have trouble confirming and denying orbs at the start of the game. Because the moment there's even the slightest amount of distance between the player and the orb, it's going to take a longer time for the bullet to travel to the orb and hit it, which makes it easier for your opponent to deny orbs. So when looking at all of these tier 1 items, we're essentially looking at stuff that can combat the weaknesses that our characters have early on in the game, or a way to enhance their strength. So moving over to the next item, we have something that is called Close Quarters, which is a little bit less universal than Basic Mag, because it gives you 25% more damage when within 15 meters range. Again, in addition to the 6% base damage that you get from this just being a tier 1 item. So again, think about in which situations this might work best, what problems does it solve, or which characters does it enhance. And in this case, I'd say that this works best on characters that have shotgun-like weapons, like Pocket, Abrams, Shiv, or even on Yamato. Because in most of those cases, you're not really going to shoot at targets outside of a 15 meter range anyway, so it just adds a 25% weapon damage to your gun permanently. And a bonus is that this item is essentially just as strong as the melee lifesteal item on the Vitality page, also a tier 1 item, if you're looking for raw melee damage. Because yes, that 25% of damage that applies to close range on your weapon also applies to your melee. And that also makes it easier to kill the minions in the wave. So if you're a character that sits in the middle of the lane a lot, then Close Quarters is a very strong pickup. It isn't always so easy though, because a lot of the items are also only situationally good. And a good example of that would be Hollow Point Ward. Hollow Point Ward is an item that gives you more damage if you're above 60% health. It's a great item if you're up against somebody that can't really get to you if you just sit under your Guardian. So if you're up against an Abrams, for example, or a Lash, if you stay far enough away from them, they can't really touch you, and so they will not be able to take away that 20% damage that you now have. But if you're laning against, for example, a Kelvin, or a Geist, or even a Great Talon that all have grenades, or the arrows that have very strong poke damage, as we like to refer to it, then Hollow Point Ward might not be the best pickup, because it's likely they're going to poke you down below 60% health, which means from that moment on, this item will be useless, at least until you heal back up. This is why players that go for Hollow Point Ward also like to combine it with Restorative Shot, another situationally good item in the lane. And this is why understanding what to buy in which case is so important, and why you can't just buy the same thing every single game, because depending on who you're playing as and who you're laning up against, it's going to change what items you might want to pick up. I promised to also cover Headshot Booster, and this is a bit of a special item, so I'll just go over it. This is an item that is great if you want to, for example, duel a lot in the lane, which just means you want to fight the enemy a lot. This item, I would say, is also a bit more situational, maybe depending on what character you're playing, or maybe depending on what your opponent is playing as. Headshot Booster, for example, does not work on minions, it does not work on guardians, and that indeed means that this item, which can be very strong, can also be very bad and just straight up useless if the headshots that you're doing are not doing meaningful damage to the enemy, which could be because they're just healing up, or because they just have too much health to burn down anyway. The opposite of that would be monster rounds. This is a great item that carries quite some value into the mid game too if you're big on doing jungle or maybe just split pushing. And this one gives you 0 value against players, but you get 35% extra damage and damage resistance versus NPCs. And that includes the minions and the guardian in the lane too. If you ever find yourself in a position where you're not really looking to kill the opponent because you don't think you can win a straight up duel, but you still want to win your lane and apply a ton of pressure through simply shoving the wave, then Monster Round can become invaluable. And just so that we have every item here on the weapons page covered, we also have Rapid Round, which is just another way to add more universal DPS to your character early on. This one specifically is great for heroes such as Haze or Infernus that get stacks based on bullets hit. If you want to quickly apply Afterburn, for example, set people on fire, or if you want to max out your fixation stacks early on in the lane, then Rapid Round allows you to do that with more ease. Now, unfortunately, the tier 1 vitality page isn't going to be as interesting when it comes to the tier 1 items, mostly because it is just different ways of staying alive. But that also allows us to learn more about the game by seeing what we can do to react to how our opponent is playing. And also, I want to make clear that these items shouldn't be overlooked because soul for soul, these vitality items might just be the strongest tier 1 items in the game simply because of how much health they can give you early on. To give another example, we can look at Vindicta, which is a pretty squishy hero that starts off with 550 health in the lane at level 1, which is not a lot, but getting just 2 of these green tier 1 items like extra health, which yes is the strongest one in this case, and then extra stamina, it brings it up to 830. That is a 50% increase for just 1000 souls, which not only makes it easier to play with other items, like for example Hollow Point Ward again, but also makes you near impossible to burst down until later into the game. Of course, these items are so good because it comes at the cost of you not being able to buy the weapon damage items, which means that you then don't have as much pressure. But the item extra health does, for example, on the current patch, have 5% of damage, and extra stamina, for example, comes with Rate of Fire. It's not much, but it isn't nothing either. So how do we know which one to take when, and when to take them over the weapon damage items? Well, again, it all depends on how you're doing in the lane. My first advice would be to take none of these if you're winning the lane from the get-go, because there's not much a point into building into more survivability if the opponents aren't much of a threat anyway. A good rule of thumb would be, if you're winning, just focus on winning harder, and if for some reason you cannot win harder because the opponents are playing super safe and just sitting under their guardian and just burning every wave and you just can't seem to do much, then it might be a good idea to start roaming. Move over to the lane that is closest and see if you can help your teammates out, maybe get a pick over there, and then you can move back.
Here's the grand finale. Here comes...
If you are struggling in the lane though, if you're losing the lane, maybe it just isn't a winnable matchup, or maybe you're just not playing that well, a good idea would always be to try and lose the lane slower. The map of Deadlock may seem pretty big, but at the higher levels you'll often find that teammates rotate all the time. And losing the lane slower allows for the teammates that are winning to get their guardian and then come help you out to maybe protect yours.
I'm disabled, I can't help you.
And one really good way to lose slower is to spec into more vitality items, because so long as you aren't dying, it is going to be very difficult for the opponents to push down the guardian without you pushing them away from it. There are a bunch of different options when it comes to building more into survivability. We'll look at Enduring Spirit first, which is a good way of staying alive if your character dishes out a lot of spirit damage. 7 would be a good example of this with his Power Surge, but Infernus and his Afterburn ability can work just as well. I'd say you can take extra health on pretty much any squishy character, like the example I've given with Vindicta, to make yourself really difficult to burst down, because so long as Vindicta is alive and well enough, she for example can sit much further back than most heroes and still do considerable damage. Extra regen would be a good option if your opponents again have a lot of poke, so those same nades from maybe Kelvin or Lady Geist. And a little tip, you can always see the current health regeneration that you have right on top of your health bar. It's this little number right here. That is how much health you're getting back every single second. Extra stamina is always a good pickup if you plan on going superior stamina in the later game. So yeah, some of these items you're picking specifically because they're part of other items later on. Melee lifesteal, I would say, is a bit more situational. If you're looking for melee damage, then again, the close quarters is almost always a better option due to weapon damage also scaling up to melee damage. But melee lifesteal feels great on heroes like Abrams or even on Bebop or Viscous. Abrams, I think, speaks for itself really because all he does is punch. But Bebop's uppercut and Viscous's fist both count as light melee attacks as well. So when using these, you will heal for 100 plus health every time that you land them. Now I'm going to say something that's a bit more controversial before we move over to the spirit page. And that is that I think that sprint boots are almost always a must for whatever character you're playing. This is not because they're so good by themselves, but more so because they are a component of enduring speed. And I think that enduring speed is one of the most powerful items in the game, especially for its price range. I almost always get enduring speed on every single hero that I play. And the reason for this is that I keep telling my friends that these MOBAs are all about being at the right place at the right time. And having the extra move speed and sprint speed that comes with enduring speed, it just makes that part of the game, being in the right place at the right time, a lot easier. You'll end up burning less stamina to rotate to different lanes, you'll end up catching more waves on your way there, you'll end up being able to save teammates that you otherwise wouldn't have, and all these small bonuses, they start adding up in a somewhat invisible way over the span of a whole game. I would never buy sprint boots as a first or a second item, but by the 5th or the 6th item, I almost always have it. Again, just to round up the Vitality tier 1 items, we have the Healing Rite, which I also think is very strong. It's the only active item that we've covered so far, and you can use this and either put it on a teammate or on yourself to heal you all the way back up almost to full health, so long as you don't take damage from enemy heroes. It will also give you extra sprint speed while it is active, so this item is great if you, for example, are getting hard bullied in the lane, but you don't have a boost anymore to go back to base. You can buy this, put it on yourself when you're low, and again, so long as you at least kill 3 extra troopers than you otherwise would have going back to base and back to the lane, I think it is worth to buy this even temporarily. Now we're going to cover the tier 1 spirit items as well because it's important to see just what they do. We'll skip Ammo Scavenger and we'll circle back to that at the end of it because I want to start off with the most basic of the spirit tier 1 item. And that is, well, it is Extra Spirit, which is that item that soul for soul gives you the most extra spirit out of any of the tier 1 items, out of any of the items in the game basically. And whether you should be picking this up or not, well, that depends on one thing and one thing only. Do my abilities scale up well enough with spirit power? And am I going to go for improved spirit and maybe even boundless spirit later in the game? On Pocket, for example, you would assume that because all of his abilities deal a lot of damage, and because he is sort of a mage a little bit, that extra spirit would be great on him. But as a certified Pocket main and absolute degenerate, I'd have to disagree, because all of his abilities actually have pretty poor spirit power scaling. There's 1.4 on both of his 1 ability and his ultimate, then a 0.7 on the satchel, and a 1.1 on the teleport, which is respectable, but still not that much. If we compare that to Great Talon, for example, this guy has some good spirit power scaling. His arrow is pretty crazy at 1.6, and later in the game, that turns into 2.5. So what I usually end up doing is going for a lot of spirit on Talon, but not really picking it on Pocket, even though you'd think that with how Pocket works, it would just be a spirit character too. I'll elaborate on that a little bit more, and the best way that I can do that is by looking at the next item, which is Mystic Burst. This is also a spirit item, but is a bit more situational. Basically, it boosts the damage of your abilities if they meet a specific damage threshold. In this case, that threshold would be 80. So if your ability does more than 80 damage, then Mystic Burst activates and it will add an extra 35 damage on top of it. Now this, despite Pocket not having good spirit power scaling, would be a good pickup on Pocket because his base abilities without any upgrades deal 90 and 100 damage. So in this case, Mystic Burst is going to give me far more damage, far more often than the extra spirit item would. In short, if your hero has an ability with 80 or more damage right from the start, like maybe the Dynamo Stomp or maybe Bebop's bombs, then this item is almost a no-brainer. And that counts even if you tend to go for a more weapon damage based build, because guess what? Mystic Burst also gives you a bit of weapon damage. And since we are constantly trying to get the most out of our 12 slots at the start, looking for these core stats on items that are from a different category can be a really good way to stack up on more base stats instead of simply just buying more expensive items all from the same category. Mystic Reach can also be great on some heroes too. I often see a lot of Wardens take this to extend the area of their cage a bit, but I personally like it a lot more on heroes such as Geist to make that grenade area even larger than it already is. And obviously you also pick this on Dynamo because it also affects his ult, and you usually go for improved reach later down the line. Again, to round this off, let's look at Infuser, which is the only active item in this category, and it basically just gives you a bunch of spirit power on demand with a bunch of spirit lifesteal. This one can be good on the same heroes that extra spirit is good on. A good example again would be 7. Also, we kind of skipped over the 2 items at the start, I almost forgot, but swinging back around to the extra charge. This one is only available to purchase on some heroes to begin with, heroes with ability charges to begin with, so you cannot buy this on Abrams, not on Bebop, not on Haze, because they don't have any abilities with extra charges. But heroes like McGinnis for her turrets, or Grey Talon for his arrows, or Lash with his grapple, I think every hero that can buy this item, for the most part, it's going to be a must pick. Simply because heroes that have all these charges usually rely so much on them for their gameplay, and being able to just use that ability back to back to back, it's almost like you have a 4th ability. It can greatly increase your damage or your survivability. And then just to round up everything, we have Ammo Scavenger, the very last item in the tier 1 slot. This is more of a niche item, but it can situationally still be a great pick. What it does is that it returns 2 ammo to the magazine every time you secure or deny an orb, as well as giving you 2 spirit power, with the max stacks being 12, amounting to 24 extra spirit in the current patch. And yeah, I find this especially strong on Haze because her base magazine also scales with spirit power, and this works on that as well. So this item alone can potentially change that 25 mag into a 45 mag, which is just insane and makes the argument for basic mag on Haze almost not an argument at all. Now that was a whole watch list, right? And now you might understand why I don't want to do this for every tier of items. And I think that especially after the tier 2 items, we're going to get a really good understanding of how to build our characters. Because with the cheap items out of the way, and now that we're going up a tier, now that these items are going to cost much more, we are also going to have to change the way that we think about them. I mentioned that the tier 1 items costing 500 can pretty much be taken depending on the matchup. But with items costing 1250, that is already starting to be a bit of a pain point. At the stage of the game, when you're starting to buy these 1250 and 3000 items, you're not just going to be laning anymore. There's going to be players that will start roaming the map, they will start ganking, you're going to start thinking about taking camps, you will generally see a lot of team fights, and the further this goes into the game, the more common these fights are going to be. And so the items that you buy, you slowly want to transition how you think about them as well. And what that means is that if you're still losing your lane, if you're still not really winning or doing anything, then it might just be time to simply start doing something else. Go to a different lane, start ganking instead of holding your lane, start doing camps, start doing something that your character is stronger at, rather than buying more and more items just to try and win the lane back. So that's the general mindset you need to have with the tier 2 and then the tier 3 and then also the tier 4 items going forward. So for the sake of practice, for the sake of information, I'm now going to run through all the tier 2 items and tell you what is typically stronger in which situations. And then with all the information that you'll learn here, you can extrapolate that to tier 3 and tier 4 items as well. So the first one on the list in the tier 2 weapon category would be an item called Active Reload. It is a passive item that acts a little bit as an active item because once every 17 seconds, you will see your reload come up with this bar. And if you've ever played a game like Gears of War, pressing reload again at the right time during this bar will instantly reload the magazine and give you a rate of fire buff and some bullet lifesteal. So yeah, again, much like the basic mag in the tier 1 category, this one is very strong and has the same purpose. For characters that have a high rate of fire and often find themselves reloading, this is a great pickup. A good example again would be a Haze, trying to quickly get in, burst someone down, and then get out, basically get a kill that she otherwise wouldn't have been able to because the reload time on her gun alone would have meant she would have to leave the fight before confirming the kill. Berserker is the next one on the list and is in many ways the opposite of Active Reload. This one is, for example, best suited for heroes that love to stay in fights for longer times. It gives you 5% more weapon damage every 110 damage that you take, up to a maximum of 50% extra damage. This item is especially good, again, for example, on Abrams, because he heals a portion of the incoming damage by default. Kinetic Dash is another great item, but again, also on some heroes only, and also only in certain situations. The way that this one works is that every 8 seconds, your next jump dash will only consume 1 stamina bar instead of 2. And when it does so, you will get some rate of fire and 5 bullets back into your magazine. And yeah, you can already tell 5 bullets is a laughable amount on some heroes. So by default, this item is just not going to be very strong or impactful on a lot of the cast of heroes. But on heroes like Pocket or Geist, it can be game changing. Long range is again a pretty self-explanatory talent. 40% extra damage, but also only if you're beyond 15 meters from your opponent. So only situationally great on some of the heroes out there. Charged Melee, another really good example of a talent that is really strong, but only on some heroes. Again, mostly on Abrams. Now, we're not going to cover every single item here. I think that this gives you a good enough idea of how these items work and how they are designed. And when we go over to the Vitality tab, I'd say that, again, the options aren't as flashy as that they were for the Weapons tab, but even more so than with the tier 1 options, the majority of these can be considered reactionary picks, which is great for learning and understanding of when to buy what. All of these are not so much about making your own character stronger, but more about trying to counter what the opponents have. This time, not from a laning perspective, but more from a teamfight perspective. And there's quite a lot of options here, but you'll find that a lot of these are very similar, they just work in slightly different ways. So if you're just looking for the best defensive options and nothing else, then Bullet and Spirit Armor are probably your safest bets. They each provide 20 Bullet and 20 Spirit Armor respectively, which doesn't sound like that much, and you're right, but they are the only items in this tier, together with Debuff Reducer, which is its own separate thing that we'll look at soon, that can be upgraded later down the line. Into Improved Bullet and Improved Spirit Armor, which both provide 45% resistance for their respective damage types, and that is a lot. That makes you almost twice as tanky against incoming damage, and it also makes all the other items in the game that provide some sort of resistance that much stronger. And there's quite a few items that do that. You can see them here if you just type in resist. The reason that it makes the other items with resistances stronger is simply because of how resistances in games work. If you have an amount that is 0 and an amount that is 100, and you assume that 100% resistance blocks all of the incoming damage 100%, well, that means that the closer that you get to 100%, the stronger every additional percentage gets relatively to the last. If we take an example, that means that if you have Improved Spirit Armor, which is 45%, and then add Colossus to it, which gives you another 40%, but in this case that would amount to 67% because they're calculated multiplicatively, well, that still makes you 3 times as tanky as you otherwise would have been against spirit damage. With the fact that these resistances apply to your entire health pool, which also increases as the game goes on, that makes Improved Spirit and Improved Bullet Resistance the go-to items for late game survivability. The downside is that the non-improved versions that we're looking at now, the ones with only 20%, they're not that strong, especially not when compared to some of the items that we're going to look at soon. So when it comes to the Vitality page, you've got 2 choices to make always. First of all would be, what type of damage am I building resistances for? Is it going to be bullet damage? Is it going to be spirit damage? And then the second choice you have to make is, do I want to be powerful now, or do I want to be powerful in the late game? If I want to be powerful in the late game, we're going to go for the resistances. And if we want to be powerful right now, well, then a better option might be the combat or enchanted barriers that provide the player with a 300 point bullet or spirit shield, and also give you a bunch of extra damage or spirit power when you have those shields up. Again, soul for soul, the barriers, the ones that give you the shields, they are far stronger in the early to the mid game. But for all the reasons that we discussed just now, they also do tend to fall off faster. Other options on the tier 2 Vitality page are Bullet and Spirit Lifesteal, which are generally great neutral picks, more depending on what your character is good at. Do you have a lot of bullet damage? Well, Bullet Lifesteal is great. It allows you to take the jungle camps without having to go back to base in between. And if you have a lot of strong abilities, well, then the same goes for Spirit Lifesteal. Do the enemies have a lot of stuns? Well, then you can go for Debuff Reducer, which reduces the damage and the duration of all negative status effects applied to you. Again, this one can also be upgraded to Debuff Remover, which purges all currently applied status effects too. It includes the Warden Cage, the 7 stun, the knockdowns, and even Bebop's bombs. So if the enemies don't really have too much damage, but they're very heavy on the crowd control, then Debuff Remover would be a good option. And then on the healing side of things, we have a bunch of very undervalued items because they're not that flashy, but Healbane especially can be very strong because you apply a 40% heal reduction when you hit any hero with any of your abilities, which is great against characters like McGinnis, Dynamo, and Abrams, and can be absolutely devastating for them if suddenly they're missing like half the healing that they usually get. Moving over to the spirit side of things, we have a lot less items on the tier 2 page, but we can look at a few of these. For example, Quicksilver Reload. Instead of reloading the normal way, you can just apply this item to any ability, and then when you press that ability, it reloads the gun for you. Very strong on characters like Haze and Rite that typically benefit a lot from having a larger mag. And then on the spirit page, you will usually also find a bunch of really strong crowd control options. In tier 2 specifically, we have the Slowing Hex, which silences movement-based abilities, really strong against heroes like Pocket or Infernus. But if you go down to tier 3, there's Knockdown and Silence Glyph and all sorts of stuff that are very specific counters to specific heroes. If you want to know more about those, I've made a whole video on crowd control and when to go for what items, so I'm not going to cover that here. Just know that if you're looking for a specific counter to a specific hero, you can usually find it on the spirit page and just look at the active items. And yeah, going down the tiers from here, you'll see that you'll find a lot of similarities. Burst Fire on the weapon page is just a big boy version of Shift Striker. Headhunter is the big boy version of High Velocity Mag. Point Blank is the big boy version of Close Quarters. Titanic Magazine is Basic Magazine's big brother. Spirit Armor, Improved Spirit Armor. Melee Lifesteal, Life Strike. And then there's Superior Stamina, which is just the big brother of Extra Stamina. And I think the same would go for the tier 4 items. Like, yeah, if the enemies are stunning you a lot, maybe go for Unstoppable. If you lack damage, go for Glass Cannon. If you need more protection because people keep shooting at you when you use your 7 ult, go for Divine Kevlar. And many other edge cases that we will not talk about now, because again, the goal was not to get lost too much in the details themselves, but just to get you into the item shop and get you thinking properly about when you should pick specific items and how you should look at all of these different items. My best advice would still be just to play a bunch, test a bunch in the sandbox, and try to create your own builds and see where they fall short. That's how I learned a lot about the game. My first Pocket build kind of looked like this, and that was not too good. So don't be afraid to go crazy, try some stuff out, and then see where it falls short. You can also see what other builds people have made. Maybe start there and keep swapping some things around based on personal preference. And yes, once I get all these initial guides out of the way, I will also start making my own character guides and my own builds and going really into the details that I was not able to do today, because otherwise this video would be far too long if it isn't already. So yeah, that is the most comprehensive guide of the item shop that I can possibly give you without literally looking at every single item and just reading them out word by word. I hope it was helpful because it sure was a lot of work for me to get this video out. But now that it's finished, I can finally go back to playing the game some more. Because past week, I mean, you can see by the upload schedule, it's been a grind, man. So I'm gonna go back to playing a bit more now, and then very soon we'll get to all the advanced guides. So yeah, thank you all so much for watching, and you will see me very, very soon.